aphantasics experience mental images, but they're not conscious of them. So it's a problem of metacognition, meaning the image is there, I just don't feel it, but I'm using the image to answer the question, which is like unconscious mental imagery is there, but it's unconscious.
That information is ingrained in the brain somehow, but just not in images, or maybe in images. I know Adam Zeman sort of maybe has this idea of unconscious imagery that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. Like, how do
Right.
you think, or do you think we know how that information is being encoded in the brain?
They haven't seen interesting or convincing findings yet.
So what about non-visual imagination then? Where is my taste imagination happening? Where is my emotional imagination happening? My proprioceptive, my interoceptive? I mean, we imagine in all of these different ways. I think I'm very bodily in my imagination. Everything is sort of very embodied, and I'm always curious about where the hell that is. So we were very visual dominated there, but what about the rest?
That's a great question. And I'm not a specialist in this area. I don't specialize a lot in other forms of visual mental imagery, just because, again, we need to be focused. But I know that you, Silvanto, started working a lot on this a connection between interoception, so bodily signals, and visual imagination. And that was exactly what I was kind of incorrectly interrupting you earlier by saying, like, hey, but let's not forget that not everything happens in the brain, or better, that the brain is connected to an entire body, and that body brings signals, and nerves are so important, and so on, right? So certainly there is a two-way highway, and your example about gustatory signals is so important. I tell you, imagine an apple, and maybe you're salivating way before
Yeah.
then coming up with, or imagine a lemon, and you're like, and you have a reject kind of response, right?
I've
So
been tasting apples, honestly, for the whole 20 minutes we've been talking about imagining apples. I've actually been kind of on repeat biting into an apple, and like I am salivating, like I can taste it. I'm going to go buy an apple after this.
it happens. So again, so the point being, maybe again, what is the role of interoceptive internal signals in helping to imagine things, right? This is all connected. One of the strategies that Rishan Reader identified is some people, rather than visualizing things, they may have a tactile experience, right? For example, if you tell me which one is bigger between two objects, right? Rather than visualizing them, I can be like, well, this one will weigh more than the other one, so I'll go with this, right? So
Right.
this is a signal that goes to the somatosensory system and the somatosensory cortex, blah, 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 through nerves. So what is the role of these other areas is so important. Now, again, if you tell me, imagine a concert at the music of a concert, right? Imagine being at the opera. I'm an opera lover and I love music in general. Well, if you tell me, imagine Verdi, Giuseppe Verdi, or Rossini, or Puccini, just to name some Italian composers, well, I will see myself in the opera house, at the opera house. So
Right.
that will come with a visual experience together with the auditory experience and so on. So this is all interconnected, and it's going to be hard to find just one brain region that does imagination. I don't think that what the fin does is all of imagery, right? And it's going to be hard to find one difference between images and aphantasics. That's not how the brain works, and so on. So your question about what happens in other regions is very important. Likely, still, a principle may be, if you imagine an auditory stimulus, you shouldn't recruit the primary sensory region. Like if you imagine a visual stimulus, you shouldn't recruit primary sensory region. Otherwise, again, the question becomes, how are you distinguish it from reality, right? If there's no piece different between the two, what differentiates imagination from reality, right? There is an interesting study that showed that primary auditory cortex isn't activated when a pianist rehearses a song, with the
Interesting.
keyboard off. when the keyboard is off, right? So just playing and imagining the sound that they're playing, the primary auditory cortex isn't activated. So again, this could be a principal link in the different
Right.
modalities. Otherwise, you confuse them, you mistake them for real percept. And that's hallucination. And we go back to what we were discussing before.
Yeah, fascinating. I find all of this just deeply fascinating. We're sort of running out of time, so I wanted to touch on one more area, although I
Yeah.
have no fewer than 700 questions more on everything we were just talking about. You've done a lot of work with Stanislas Dehaene. He's obviously a very prominent consciousness researcher. He has his global neuronal workspace theory. I think one of the things that captured me with aphantasia and inner experience is a gateway into consciousness, and how understanding aphant and what's happening there could give us little entry points into consciousness, and not just the theoretical models, but also the phenomenology, which can also be forgotten. You know, a lot of our consciousness theories don't really go any distance in terms of actually capturing what the hell it feels like to be a human, what the phenomenology is, the subjective experience. And again, that's where you can kind of maybe make a bit of headroom with aphantasia. With all of your decades research in this space, what do you think we can learn about consciousness through the study of people that don't have mental imagery?
Great question. And I mean, Stan Dehaene has been publishing on this for so long, and they have this global neuronal workspace theory, which is very interesting. And I believe that Zhang Hao's data, so Zhang Hao new data on the functional disconnection between the frontal lobe and the fusiform imagery node, kind of supports what one of the main claims of the global neuronal workspace theory that distinguishes from other theory, which is to be conscious of something, you need the frontal lobe to be part of that experience, right? You need the frontal lobe to be activated to be conscious of something. um, and that's actually what happens in Zhang Hao's data, right? Individuals with aphantasia, or the reverse, individuals with aphantasia are not conscious of that mental image, and indeed, their frontal lobe fusiform imagery node, this connection is not there, right? So we really believe, we framed in the paper, these two data points are supporting, right? Or this data point are supporting the global neuronal workspace theory, right? Which is a functionalist theory of consciousness, looking at what the function of consciousness is, right? So I think that there is another part of what you said, which is very important, which is a mantra, something that we always have to remember ourselves, remind ourselves of when we are in a laboratory, that when we create these experiments, we create them in laboratory settings that are very controlled and using very simplified stimuli. But then the biggest challenge is how to talk about consciousness with the capital C, from a I just asked you to imagine an apple, right? So there's a distance between what we are what we can start in control environment with the capital C conscious experience. But again, our data supports the global neural workspace theories, or support anyone saying that conscious experience of something is associated with frontal involvement, with involvement of frontal regions. That's what we found. We'll see whether additional, data provided in the future will continue supporting this point of view, which is likely, I would say, I think.
Is there also a little bit of maybe support for IIT with the frontal cortex and the imagery node not being integrated? I think IIT can sometimes score points maybe incidentally, because integration is kind of maybe clearly an important role here, but it also seems like maybe there's a point in the
Yeah.
column of IIT because what you're seeing there isn't functional integration between the frontal cortex and the fusiform imagery node.
Mhm. Okay, so IIT, information integrated information theory. Sorry. Yeah. So I would say two things. First, I want to, disclaimer. Um, I wouldn't necessarily adjudicate, or our study, the study that we did with Zhang Hao, wasn't created to adjudicate between two theories of consciousness, right? So I want our audience to be mindful of the fact that any evidence found from a study that isn't created to test a thing must be considered anecdotal. So what we found is anecdotal evidence in favor of the global neural workspace theory, but our study wasn't created to adjudicate between the two. There is actually a very large grant conducted by Lucia Meloni and many others that is trying to adjudicate, meaning create experiments that really will be able to show whether the global neural workspace theory or the integrated information theory or other theories kind of have more support in science. And that's part of a very large grant funded by the Templeton Foundation that Lucia Meloni and others and Iliad Mudrik are conducting. And I would say that, yeah, there is some evidence also for IAT in our data, but again, the study wasn't done to test that. So if our audience is interested in knowing what's going on when you compare the two theories onto predictions that can be answered by the same experiment, then that's what I will refer to the most, right?
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel